This is a pretty simple formula. If the capacity of your service is greater than the attack size, you're going to be able to absorb the attack. Remember, the whole premise of a denial of service attack is to flood resources with malicious requests so that they can't serve legitimate requests. If the attacker is unable to achieve that objective because you simply have so much capacity that you can service not only all the legitimate requests, but the malicious ones as well, then their attack is going to be quite a failure. Let's move on and I'll show you what I mean by that. Here's a pretty straightforward example. Let's imagine we have internet connectivity of 100 gigabits a second through to our website. In simple terms, this is a pretty basic formula. If we've got 100 gigabits and our legitimate traffic is consuming no more than 20 gigabits, we've got an 80 gigabit buffer. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you're always sitting there with 100 gigabits worth of capacity, but particularly in this era of cloud, if you can simply turn up the capacity up to that level, up to 100 gigabits, then you've got a lot of buffer available. There are few easier defenses against a distributed denial of service attack in particular than just overwhelming it with capacity. Bandwidth is certainly part of it, but remember, capacity of things like the web application, the database application, any services that sit in there, if all of those are tunable such that when an attack comes in, you can simply scale them to the point where they absorb it, then that's going to put a massive dent in the effectiveness of that attack. And not only that, but we're building services more and more in this way lately. We're building them so that we can scale them up in response to demand. Normally we expect to have legitimate organic demand, but it's the same ability to scale the infrastructure that can help us defend against that DOS attack. Let's go and have a look at a few of the pros and cons of this approach. So, absorbing the attack, both pros and cons. And firstly, on the pro side, if you can absorb all that malicious traffic, the good news is that there may well be no disruption for legitimate users. As far as they know, the website's still functioning. You're managing to successfully handle both their traffic and the malicious traffic. So downtime is at a minimum. And particularly if you can scale those resources quickly in order to respond to the unexpected load of a denial of service attack, then there's going to be a really, really low friction on the users. As I've mentioned a couple of times now, autoscale is fantastic, particularly in the cloud era. Now, very often this is fully automated. There are services that will respond to load and increase the capacity of the resources. Other times it may be something that you need to explicitly scale, but it is literally just a slider or a value or the size of the machines. Being able to turn it up and simply absorb all that extra malicious traffic is something that was very difficult to do only a few short years ago. Much easier today in the cloud era. One of the really big advantages of being able to absorb the attack is that it buys you time. So this is not to say that this is the only defense, that you just increase scale and inevitably pay more money and you leave it that way for perpetuity. But if the ease and speed at which you can increase scale allows you to keep the service running whilst you spend more time analysing the attack and identifying other ways to block it altogether, then that's a good result. But let's go and look at the cons. And one of the cons is what I just mentioned, pay more money. It can become expensive. Capacity can become expensive. Cloud resources are great in terms of their ability to spin them up quickly, but it is pay for what you use as well. If you have to triple your capacity, then you will probably pay triple the price. Now that's in a very elastic cloud environment. If you're still running on-premise, or if you're dependent on physical infrastructure, then having enough capacity to weather a DDoS storm is extra expensive, because most of the time that capacity is not being used at all. It just sits there in preparation for an attack. That discussion starts to lead us down the virtues of cloud versus traditional hosting. But either way, you can see the point. Capacity comes at a cost. Now, if you are in that latter category, in the on-prem physical infrastructure sort of environment, then absorbing the attack may not even be practical. Not within a reasonable time frame, not if you've got to order infrastructure. It's a defense strategy that only works if you have fast access to that capacity. And even then, if the attack is large enough, it's not going to work. It's all just a question of degrees. We've seen just over 600 gigabits already at the time of recording. And even the services that are resilient to that today may not be resilient to 700 gigabit, 800 gigabit. There is a point where no matter how much capacity you have, someone else can flood it. So, attempting to absorb the attack is a very good starting point. It's minimal friction, it's usually the fastest response you can have, and it buys you time. Time to look at some of the other defenses. So let's go and check those out now.